The Villisca Axe Murders, the night an entire family was erased. On the night of June 9, 1912, the town of Villisca, Iowa, went to sleep as it always had. The streets were unpaved, the air carried the scent of livestock and summer grass. Front doors were often left unlocked. Neighbors knew one another by name. Nothing about that Sunday evening suggested it would become one of the most haunting nights in American criminal history. Josiah Moore, a respected businessman, had spent the evening attending Children's Day exercises at the Presbyterian Church with his wife, Sarah, and their 4 children. The event had ended around 9:30 p.m. It had been cheerful. Children singing, community gathering, lantern light flickering softly. 2 sisters, Ina and Lena Stillinger, had been invited to spend the night at the Moore home after the church event. It was common in a town like Villisca. Parents trusted neighbors. Children moved freely between homes. Around 10 p.m., the Moore family and their guests returned to the modest white house on East 2nd Street. The house was narrow, 2 stories, a small attic above, bedrooms arranged tightly along the upper level. That night, 8 people slept inside. By morning, all 8 would be dead. Sometime after midnight, while the town was silent and dark, someone entered the Moore home. There were no signs of forced entry. Investigators later believed the killer may have hidden inside the house before the family returned from church. Or he may have entered quietly after they had gone to sleep. What is certain is this: the killer carried an axe. The weapon was later identified as belonging to Josiah Moore himself, kept in the shed behind the house. That detail has always lingered. The murderer did not bring his own weapon. He used what was already there. The first victims were Josiah and Sarah Moore. They slept in a bedroom on the 2nd floor. The killer struck Josiah first. The blows were severe and repeated, more than necessary to ensure death. Then Sarah. Each victim was attacked in their beds. No evidence suggested prolonged struggle. The attacks were sudden, brutal, efficient. From there, the killer moved to the children's rooms. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul Moore, each struck with the blunt and sharp edge of the axe. The 2 sisters were killed in the guest room. Ina, 8 years old, Lena, 12. Lena may have partially awakened. Some evidence suggested defensive wounds on her arm. But in the darkness, against an adult attacker wielding an axe, there was little chance of survival. What makes the Villisca murders uniquely unsettling is not only the violence, it is what happened after. The killer remained inside the house for some time. He covered mirrors with clothing. He draped sheets over the victims' faces. He washed his hands in a bowl in the kitchen. He left slabs of bacon on the stove. He ate food from the Moore pantry. And then, sometime before dawn, he vanished. The next morning, neighbors noticed something unusual. The Moore family had not begun their day. By 8 a.m., this was strange. By 9 a.m., it was alarming. Mary Peckham, a neighbor, knocked on the door. There was no answer. She tried again. Still silence. Eventually, Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, was called. He unlocked the door and entered the house. He climbed the stairs. What he saw has been described in reports as almost unrecognizable. The bodies were discovered in their beds, blood soaked through mattresses, walls splattered, sheets pulled tightly over faces. The house quickly filled with townspeople. Before law enforcement could secure the scene, dozens had walked through it. Neighbors moved through rooms, touched objects, stared. The sheriff, Hank Horton, arrived amidst the crowd, but rural law enforcement in 1912 had limited forensic tools. No DNA analysis, no fingerprint database of value, No crime scene containment protocol as we understand today. The axe was found in the guest room, leaning against a wall. It had been wiped partially clean. Bloody fingerprints may have been present, but there was no effective method to preserve them conclusively. Footprints were observed outside near the house. Some believed they led toward the railroad tracks, but by midday, so many curious townspeople had gathered that any tracks were indistinguishable. The news spread rapidly beyond Villisca. 8 people killed in a single household, bludgeoned with an axe. No robbery, no clear motive. It captured national headlines. Because this was not a city crime, not gang violence, not a drunken dispute. It was a quiet Midwestern home and a killer who entered silently. Investigators began looking for suspects almost immediately. Suspicion fell first on transient men traveling by train, railroad workers, drifters. Villisca sat along a rail line. It was possible someone had arrived unnoticed, left unnoticed. Then suspicion turned inward. Josiah Moore had business rivals. He had once worked for a man named Frank Jones. There were rumors of tension between them. Some townspeople believed the murders were personal, targeted. Yet the brutality extended beyond Josiah. It included children, guests. The violence seemed excessive for a simple business dispute. As days passed, theories multiplied. Was it revenge, jealousy, mental illness, or something darker? One theory emerged that the killer had waited in the attic, listening, watching, descending only after the house was fully asleep. The attic showed signs of disturbance. A plate of food was found there, a cigarette butt, indicating someone may have hidden above. If true, it meant the killer was inside the house before the family returned from church, waiting, listening to their footsteps, hearing their evening conversations. The thought of that possibility has haunted the case for over a century because it changes the timeline from intrusion to infiltration, and infiltration suggests planning. The Villisca axe murders would become one of the most infamous unsolved mass murders in American history. But on that June morning in 1912, it was simply horror. A house that had been filled with children's laughter the night before now held 8 lifeless bodies. Lantern light replaced by daylight, exposing violence in full clarity. The killer was gone. No witnesses, no arrest, just silence. By noon on June 10, 1912, the house on East 2nd Street was no longer quiet. It was crowded. Farmers who had heard the news left their fields and gathered near the property. Women wept openly on the sidewalk. Children were pulled indoors by frightened parents. Reporters began arriving from nearby towns by late afternoon. The sheriff attempted to maintain order, but in a town of barely 2,000 residents, shock overrode procedure. People entered the Moore home before law enforcement had fully documented the scene. Some walked upstairs, some touched furniture, some lifted sheets. Evidence that might have mattered was trampled. It would later be said that more than 100 people passed through the house before it was secured. In modern terms, the crime scene was contaminated beyond repair. Still, investigators worked with what they could. The axe was examined more carefully. It had belonged to Josiah Moore. The shed behind the Moore house suggested the killer likely retrieved it from the family's shed. That detail suggested familiarity with the property, or at least a willingness to explore it before entering the house. There were no signs of robbery. Money remained in Josiah's wallet. Valuables were untouched. The house had not been ransacked. This was not theft. This was something else. The positioning of the bodies raised further questions. The killer had struck victims primarily with the blunt end of the axe first, knocking them unconscious before using the blade. That detail indicated method rather than frenzy. It suggested control. After each killing, sheets were pulled over faces. Mirrors throughout the house were covered. Even a hanging mirror in the parlor was draped. Investigators could not determine why. Some speculated superstition, others believed it was a way to avoid seeing reflections, perhaps even his own. The covered mirrors became one of the case's most unsettling details. They suggested the killer lingered after the murders, that he moved through the house deliberately, that he was not rushed. In the kitchen, a bowl of bloody water sat on a washstand. A towel nearby showed signs of use. The bacon left on the stove appeared partially cooked. Some investigators believed the killer had prepared food but abandoned it. Others believed he had eaten quietly before leaving. That detail, eating inside the home after committing multiple murders, disturbed even seasoned observers because it implied composure, a lack of urgency, a comfort inside a house filled with bodies. The first suspect who drew serious attention was a traveling minister named George Kelly. He had passed through Villisca days before the murders. He was known to be erratic. He had been seen peering into windows. He left town shortly after the killings. His behavior raised suspicion. Kelly was arrested months later. Under intense interrogation, he eventually confessed, but the confession was inconsistent. He claimed to have committed the murders in a daze. He described details that did not match the crime scene precisely. Some believed he had been coerced. Others believed he was mentally unstable and confessing falsely. At trial, his confession unraveled under scrutiny. There was no physical evidence placing him inside the Moore home. He was acquitted. The case returned to uncertainty. Meanwhile, attention shifted to Frank Jones, Josiah Moore's former employer. Jones was wealthy, influential, powerful within the community. Rumors suggested personal animosity between the two men. Some whispered about jealousy, others about business betrayal. There were allegations, never proven, that Jones had connections to hired killers, but no direct evidence tied him to the crime. The small-town environment amplified speculation. In Villisca, everyone knew everyone. Grudges were remembered, arguments were replayed. Over time, more than a dozen suspects were proposed: railroad workers, traveling salesmen, transient laborers. Some investigators theorized that the killer may have been a serial murderer traveling by train. Similar axe murders had occurred in other Midwestern towns around that period. Entire families killed in their beds. No robbery, no witnesses, axes found at the scene. The theory suggested a drifter moving along rail lines, selecting homes at random, entering after midnight, killing silently, and leaving before dawn. But forensic science in 1912 could not conclusively link those crimes. They remained parallel suspicions rather than proven connections. The Villisca murders lingered without resolution. Years passed. The Moore home remained standing. Visitors came to stare. The crime embedded itself into local folklore, but beneath folklore lay enduring questions. Why kill all 8 occupants? If Josiah Moore had been the primary target, why murder the children? Why kill the Stillinger sisters, guests who were not permanent members of the household? The scope of violence suggests either deep personal rage or total detachment. There was no sign of sexual assault conclusively documented, no ransom note, no political message, just execution. The methodical nature of the killings, room by room, suggests planning. The possibility that the killer hid in the attic before the family returned home adds another layer. If he waited there, he listened to them prepare for bed. He heard their evening routines. He knew exactly where they slept. He descended only after silence settled. The attic floor showed indentations, suggesting someone had lain there. A key ring belonging to Josiah Moore was found there as well. It had been removed from his pocket. Why place it there? Was it dropped accidentally? Was it symbolic? The absence of clear answers has allowed the Villisca axe murders to persist in American memory for over a century, not because of courtroom drama, but because of unresolved intrusion, a killer inside a home, in darkness, without alarm, without capture. Late at night, when this story unfolds slowly, the house feels alive again. Creaking wooden floors, wind through thin window panes, 8 people sleeping under summer air, and somewhere inside, perhaps above them in the attic, someone waiting for the final lamp to go out, waiting for breathing to slow, waiting for silence, then descending. As weeks turned into months after the murders in Villisca, something more unsettling than violence settled over the town. It was uncertainty, the kind that does not fade. Because when a crime has no clear perpetrator, the fear does not attach to one person, it attaches to everyone. Neighbors looked at one another differently. Men who had once shared tools now wondered about alibis. Families locked doors at night, something that had rarely been necessary before. The killer had not broken in, he had not smashed a window, he had entered quietly and left quietly. That detail meant he could do it again. Investigators began examining similarities between the Villisca murders and other axe killings that had occurred between 1911 and 1912 across several Midwestern states. In Colorado Springs, in Kansas, in Louisiana, in Illinois, entire families killed in their beds, axes found inside the homes, mirrors sometimes covered, doors locked from within. No robbery. The pattern was difficult to ignore. Some historians later proposed that Villisca may have been part of a larger series committed by a traveling killer moving along railroad lines. Railroads were the highways of that era. A man could arrive at dusk and leave before sunrise without leaving much trace. He could study neighborhoods, observe routines, select a house that appeared vulnerable. The Moore home sat near the rail line, close enough for someone to enter town unnoticed and depart before dawn. He struck primarily from above, often aiming for the head, the blunt side first to avoid blood spray too early, then the blade. This was not random flailing, it was technique. The Reverend George Kelly case became a cautionary example. Another unsettling detail was the positioning of Lena Stillinger. She was found partially uncovered, unlike the other victims whose faces were covered. Some investigators speculated that the killer may have hesitated. The killer's decision to cover mirrors continues to fascinate criminologists. Was it superstition, a belief in spirits, or the idea that souls remain near mirrors after death? Or was it practical, to prevent accidental reflection of himself in low light? The covering of mirrors required time. The bacon on the stove, the plate in the attic, the bowl of bloody water. These small domestic details amplify the horror, because they suggest the killer felt no urgency. He may have eaten inside the house after killing 8 people. He may have rested, listened, ensured silence before leaving. When dawn approached, he likely walked out the same way he entered. The front door was locked from inside when discovered, the back door too. Years later, the Moore house became an object of fascination. Stories of unexplained sounds emerged, footsteps, doors closing. The Villisca axe murders endure not because of courtroom drama, they endure because of absence. No identified killer, no motive confirmed, no closure. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the fear is not loud, it is subtle. It is the idea that someone could enter a wooden house while everyone sleeps, stand over a bed, lift an axe, and leave before sunrise. No fingerprints preserved, no photographs in newspapers capturing the suspect, just memory and speculation. In the end, Villisca became more than a crime. It became a symbol of vulnerability, of how safety can be illusion, of how a town can carry a question for over a century without answer. In the years after the murders, life in Villisca continued, but it never felt the same, and the Stillinger sisters had only come over for a sleepover. That detail may be the most haunting. Which means the killer either didn't care who was inside, or he didn't know. Imagine the stillness of an attic on a summer night in 1912, waiting until breathing deepens, waiting until the last whisper fades, then descending. It feels like infiltration. For modern listeners, the Villisca axe murders feel almost cinematic. A family went to sleep, a killer entered, 8 lives ended. No one heard enough to stop it. No one saw enough to identify him, and he was never caught. Late at night, when this story settles, the Villisca axe murders remain officially unsolved. A guest room with 2 sisters, an axe leaning against a wall, and morning light revealing what darkness concealed. Entire household erased, no witness, no capture, only memory and silence. Thank you for listening.
The BTK killer case. A pattern that hid in plain sight. In the mid-1970s, a series of crimes began to unsettle the city of Wichita, Kansas. They did not happen all at once. They were separated by time, and at first they appeared disconnected. Families were attacked inside their homes. There were no signs of forced entry in many cases. The crimes occurred quietly, often at night. Over time, investigators would come to understand that these acts were committed by a single individual. He would later become known as the BTK Killer. The name came from the words he used to describe his actions: bind, torture, kill. The person responsible was Dennis Rader. For decades, he remained unidentified. Dennis Rader was born in 1945 and raised in Kansas. To neighbors and co-workers, he appeared ordinary. He held steady employment. He was involved in his church. He lived a quiet suburban life. Nothing about his public image suggested criminal activity. The first known attacks attributed to BTK occurred in 1974. A family was found killed inside their home. There were no witnesses. There was little physical evidence. Police struggled to understand how the crime had been committed without alerting neighbors. Then, months later, another incident occurred. And then another. As patterns emerged, investigators realized they were dealing with a serial offender. The crimes shared similarities. The suspect appeared to plan in advance. He targeted residential homes. He waited for opportunities. The offender showed knowledge of the neighborhoods. In some cases, he entered homes without drawing attention. In others, he communicated with victims before the attack. Despite these similarities, identifying the suspect proved difficult. There were no reliable eyewitnesses. Forensic technology at the time was limited. The crimes left communities fearful. Residents changed routines. People locked doors more carefully. Trust eroded quietly. Then something unexpected happened. The killer began communicating with the media and police. Letters arrived. In them, the writer described the crimes. He demanded attention. He referred to himself using the initials BTK. These communications confirmed what investigators already suspected. The crimes were connected. The person responsible wanted to be known. but he did not want to be caught. After a period of activity, the crimes stopped. Years passed without new attacks. The case went cold. The name BTK remained, but the person behind it disappeared into anonymity. For nearly 3 decades, there were no confirmed communications. No new crimes linked definitively to the same offender. Investigators kept the case open. Files were reviewed periodically, but without new evidence, progress was limited. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader continued his life. He married, he raised children, he remained active in his community. No arrest was made. The BTK killer became a case discussed in law enforcement circles as an example of how offenders can blend into everyday life. Then, in the early 2000s, something changed. After years of silence, new communications began to arrive. Letters referencing old crimes were sent to the media. The tone was familiar. The style matched earlier messages. The BTK killer had returned. What followed would transform a decades-old cold case into a modern investigation. As the new letters arrived, investigators recognized patterns they had not seen in decades. The language matched earlier communications. The references aligned with details that had never been released publicly. The writer demonstrated knowledge that only the offender would possess. Law enforcement treated the renewed contact seriously. This time, however, the tools available were different. Advances in forensic science, data analysis, and digital tracking allowed investigators to examine details that would have been impossible to analyze years earlier. The letters were carefully studied. Envelopes were examined. Postmarks were recorded. The timing and locations of mailings were mapped. The writer appeared confident. In his messages, he sought recognition and control. He referenced past crimes and taunted authorities. But he also made mistakes. In one communication, the writer asked a question. He wanted to know whether a floppy disk could be traced. Police responded publicly, stating that it could not. The writer trusted the response. He sent a disk. When investigators examined it, they found metadata that had not been erased. The data led them to a computer used at a local church. From there, attention narrowed to an individual who fit the profile investigators had developed years earlier. Dennis Rader. Rader was questioned. During the interview, investigators presented evidence methodically. They referenced the communications. They referenced the disk. They referenced details only the offender would know. Rader eventually admitted responsibility. He provided detailed accounts of the crimes. His statements aligned with evidence collected decades earlier. In 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. The arrest shocked the community. People who had known him struggled to reconcile the image of a quiet neighbor with the admissions made in court. The legal proceedings moved forward. Rader chose to plead guilty. During hearings, he described his actions in a factual, detached manner. There was no attempt to dispute responsibility. The court reviewed each case individually. Victim impact statements were presented. Families spoke about years of loss, fear, and unanswered questions. The court sentenced Dennis Rader to multiple life sentences. He would never be eligible for parole. For Wichita and surrounding communities, the arrest marked the end of a long period of uncertainty. The case that had defined fear for an entire generation was finally resolved. But the resolution did not erase the impact. The crimes had altered lives. They had changed how people viewed safety in their own homes. They had demonstrated how an offender could hide behind normal routines for decades. The case also highlighted how investigative persistence and technological progress can intersect. Evidence preserved for years became decisive when paired with new methods. What once seemed unsolvable was resolved through careful, incremental work. After the sentencing, the BTK case moved from investigation into record. The crimes were no longer unresolved. The identity was known. The timeline was complete. For many families, the conclusion came decades after the loss itself. Some had waited most of their lives to hear accountability spoken aloud in court. Others had lived with uncertainty for so long that resolution felt unfamiliar. The guilty plea removed the need for prolonged trials. It also removed ambiguity. Dennis Rader would spend the rest of his life in prison. The case became a reference point for law enforcement. It demonstrated how offenders can maintain ordinary public lives while committing serious crimes in private. It also showed how long gaps in criminal activity can cause investigations to stall, even when patterns exist. Most importantly, it illustrated how mistakes made years later can undo decades of concealment. The single decision to communicate again reopened the case. Technology that did not exist when the crimes were committed became decisive. A simple piece of digital data connected a long, cold case to a real person. From that point, the investigation moved quickly. What had taken decades to uncover was resolved in months. The BTK case also changed how future investigations were approached. Preservation of evidence became a priority. Cold cases were reevaluated with new methods. Communication strategies with offenders were reconsidered. The case reminded investigators that time does not always protect those who believe they have escaped notice. For the public, the story left a lasting impression. Not because of how the crimes were described, but because of how long the truth remained hidden. A person trusted in everyday settings had carried out actions that contradicted his public identity. That contradiction is what many people remember. Late at night, when stories like this are played quietly, the focus often shifts away from the specifics and toward the passage of time. How long fear can last without answers. How slowly some truths surface. How resolution, when it comes, is often quieter than expected. The BTK case did not end with a dramatic confrontation. It ended with records, testimony, and a sentence read aloud in court. For victims and families, that was not closure, but it was finality. The case now exists as a documented history, a reminder of persistence, a reminder of patience, and a reminder that some stories take decades to finish. If you've listened through this case, you've followed a pattern that hid in plain sight for years. If the detail stayed with you, or if something about the timeline stood out, you're welcome to reflect on it. Quiet consideration is often how long cases finally settle. If this calm, late-night approach to documented crime is something you return to, more cases will follow. There is no urgency, no emphasis on shock, just another case carefully traced from uncertainty to accountability as the night continues. Thank you for listening. The Golden State Killer Case, a pattern that took decades to stop. In the mid-1970s, a series of crimes began quietly in California. They did not start with headlines. They did not begin with a known suspect. At first, they appeared unrelated. Homes were entered at night. Victims reported being watched. Personal items were moved. Then the crimes escalated. Over the next several decades, investigators would eventually link dozens of attacks, burglaries, and murders to a single individual. The person responsible would later become known as the Golden State Killer. His real name was Joseph James DeAngelo. For years, he was unidentified. Joseph DeAngelo was born in 1945. He served in the United States Navy and later worked as a police officer in California. During this time, he lived a life that appeared ordinary. He had a job, he had a family. He blended into his community. Meanwhile, a pattern of crimes was developing across multiple regions of the state. In Northern California, a series of burglaries occurred. In Central California, a string of assaults followed. Later, in Southern California, several murders were committed. At the time, these crimes were investigated separately. Different jurisdictions handled different cases. There was no immediate reason to believe they were connected. Victims described similar behaviors. The intruder often entered homes at night. He appeared prepared. He moved deliberately. He avoided detection. In many cases, the attacker left behind little physical evidence. As years passed, law enforcement began to notice similarities. The timing of the crimes, the methods used, the way victims described the suspect's behavior. Gradually, investigators began to consider the possibility that a single person was responsible. This theory would take decades to confirm. The crimes spanned from the mid-1970s into the 1980s. They occurred across hundreds of miles. Some victims survived and provided statements. Others did not. Because of the length of time and the number of locations involved, the investigation faced significant challenges. Evidence was limited. Technology was less advanced. Communication between departments was slower. As a result, the suspect remained unidentified. The case became one of the most complex unsolved crime patterns in California history. Years passed. The attacks stopped. No arrest was made. The suspect faded from public attention. But the case never closed. Advances in forensic science would later change that. In the decades after the crimes, DNA evidence collected from multiple scenes was preserved. Investigators continued to review the case periodically. They revisited old reports. They re-examined evidence. Still, no suspect emerged. It was not until the late 2010s that a breakthrough occurred. Using advances in genetic genealogy, investigators were able to compare crime scene DNA to publicly available genealogy databases. This approach was new. It had never been used successfully in a case of this scale. The results narrowed the field. Family trees were built. Relatives were identified. Eventually, investigators focused on one individual, Joseph James DeAngelo. He was living quietly in California. He was in his 70s. He had not been publicly connected to the crimes. In 2018, DeAngelo was arrested. The announcement marked the end of one of the longest-running unsolved crime investigations in the country. For victims and families, the arrest brought answers that had been delayed for decades. The legal process that followed would examine the evidence carefully, case by case. The crimes were no longer a mystery, but the impact of what had happened remained. As investigators prepared their case, they faced an unusual challenge. The crimes attributed to the Golden State Killer spanned more than a decade and involved multiple jurisdictions across California. Some incidents had occurred in the 1970s, others in the early 1980s. Each had its own reports, evidence files, and victims. Bringing them together into a single legal case required careful reconstruction. Prosecutors began by reviewing preserved DNA evidence collected from various crime scenes. Despite the passage of time, the genetic material was sufficient to establish a link between the crimes. This confirmation allowed investigators to connect incidents that had once been treated as separate cases. The evidence showed a consistent pattern. The same individual had committed burglaries, assaults, and murders across different regions. This pattern explained why the suspect had remained unidentified for so long. He moved frequently. He changed locations. He adapted his behavior. As the investigation continued, details of the suspect's past came into focus. Records confirmed that he had worked in law enforcement during part of the period when the crimes were committed. This fact raised difficult questions. It explained his familiarity with police procedures. It explained how he avoided detection. And it explained how he blended into communities without drawing attention. For victims, this revelation was deeply unsettling. During court proceedings, prosecutors outlined the scope of the crimes. They described how the suspect had targeted homes at night. They explained how he prepared in advance. They detailed how victims were selected and how he avoided leaving obvious evidence. Throughout the presentation, the focus remained factual and restrained. The goal was not to sensationalize, but to establish accountability. Victim impact statements were later presented. Survivors spoke about the long-term effects of the crimes. Families of those who did not survive described the years of uncertainty and loss. For many, the arrest came after decades of waiting. Some had believed they would never see the case resolved. The defendant did not contest the evidence. In 2020, he entered guilty plea to multiple charges, including murder and other serious crimes. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty. The court accepted the plea agreement. During sentencing, the judge reviewed the scale of the crimes, the impact across communities, the number of lives affected, the length of time the offender remained unidentified. The sentence reflected the seriousness of those actions: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For many victims and families, the conclusion of the case provided a measure of closure. Not relief from what had happened, but an end to uncertainty. The crimes had names. They had a person held responsible. The Golden State Killer was no longer an unknown presence. He was a documented offender, accountable under the law. Yet even with a legal resolution, the case left lasting questions. How many opportunities had existed to stop the crimes earlier? How did systemic limitations allow the pattern to continue? These questions are now part of the historical record. The case also marked a turning point in criminal investigation. The use of genetic genealogy demonstrated how advances in technology could reopen cases once thought unsolvable. Since then, similar methods have been applied to other cold cases across the country. Some have been resolved, others remain open. The legacy of this case is not only in its resolution, but in how it changed investigative practice, and in how it reminded the public that time does not always erase accountability. When the sentencing concluded, the Golden State Killer case moved from investigation into record. The court proceedings were over. The identity was confirmed. The timeline was documented. For many victims and families, the outcome did not erase what had happened. It did not restore lost years or undo harm, but it did end a long period of uncertainty. Some survivors had waited more than 40 years to hear a name spoken in a courtroom. Others had lived with unanswered questions for most of their lives. The resolution brought a form of acknowledgement, not justice as a feeling, but accountability as a fact. The case also became a reminder of how criminal investigations evolve. At the time the crimes were committed, technology was limited. DNA analysis was in its early stages. Information sharing between departments was inconsistent. Decades later, those limitations no longer defined the outcome. Preserved evidence, patient review, and advances in science changed what was possible. The method used to identify the suspect opened new paths for unresolved cases across the country. Cold cases, once considered permanent, began to be re-examined. Some were solved, others remain open. The Golden State Killer case now sits at the intersection of past and present. It represents both the failures of earlier systems and the potential of modern investigation. It also stands as a record of how long harm can remain hidden in plain sight. For the communities affected, the case is remembered not for spectacle, but for endurance. For the investigators who never stopped reviewing the files, it is a lesson in persistence. For the public, it is a reminder that resolution does not always come quickly. Sometimes it arrives decades later, quietly, through work that never made headlines. Late at night, when stories like this are played without interruption, the focus often shifts away from the individual details and toward the passage of time. How long events remain unresolved, how long people wait for answers, how accountability can be delayed but not always denied. Crimes committed by the Golden State Killer spanned years and locations. Their impact spanned generations. The conclusion of the case does not close that history, but it does complete the record. If you've listened through this case, you've followed a pattern that took decades to identify and even longer to stop. If a moment or detail stayed with you, you're welcome to reflect on it. Quiet consideration is often how long stories settle. If this calm, late-night approach to documented cases is something you return to, more will follow. There is no urgency, no emphasis on shock, just another case, carefully traced from uncertainty to resolution as the night continues. Thank you for listening. The Laci Peterson case, a marriage that ended in court. On the morning of December 24th, 2002, a pregnant woman went missing from her home in Modesto, California. Her name was Laci Peterson. She was 8 months pregnant. By the end of that day, she had not returned home. By the end of the week, the case had drawn national attention. By the end of the following year, it would become one of the most closely watched trials in the United States. Laci Peterson was 27 years old. She lived with her husband, Scott Peterson, in a modest home in Modesto. Friends described Laci as warm, social, and close to her family. She was excited about becoming a mother. The couple had planned to name their son Connor. On December 24th, Laci was last known to be at home. According to Scott Peterson, he left the house that morning to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina, several hours away. He later stated that when he left, Laci was at home preparing for the day. She was wearing maternity clothes. She had plans to walk the family dog and finish household tasks. That afternoon, when Scott returned home, Laci was gone. The dog was found wandering outside, still wearing its leash. Laci's car was parked at the house. Her personal belongings were inside. Scott contacted Laci's family and later reported her missing. Police arrived and began a search. At first, the case was treated as a missing person investigation. Search teams canvassed the neighborhood. Volunteers assisted. Flyers were distributed. There were no confirmed sightings of Laci after that morning. As days passed, investigators began examining Scott Peterson's account more closely. His fishing trip drew attention. The Berkeley Marina was far from Modesto, and the trip occurred on Christmas Eve. Scott stated that he had decided to fish because he had the day off. Receipts and parking records later confirmed that Scott had been in the area he claimed. However, questions remained. Why travel so far alone on a holiday? Why leave a pregnant wife at home? Investigators also uncovered information about Scott's personal life. Scott had been involved in an extramarital relationship. The woman later stated that Scott told her he had lost his wife and that this would be his first Christmas without her. This statement was made before Laci Peterson was reported missing. When this information became public, the direction of the investigation changed. Scott Peterson became the focus of intense scrutiny. Media attention increased rapidly. Search efforts expanded beyond Modesto. As weeks turned into months, no trace of Laci was found. Then, in April 2003, human remains were discovered along the shoreline of the San Francisco Bay. The remains were later identified as those of Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The location of the remains was near the area where Scott Peterson had gone fishing. At that point, the case moved from a missing person investigation to a homicide. Scott Peterson was arrested and charged with murder. The case would soon move into the courtroom, where evidence, timelines, and interpretations would be examined in detail. As investigators focused more closely on Scott Peterson, the case began to change in tone. What had started as a community search for a missing pregnant woman became a carefully examined timeline of movements, statements, and inconsistencies. Scott Peterson told police that on the morning Laci disappeared, he left the house around 9:30 a.m. He said Laci was watching television and planned to mop the floor before walking the dog. He drove several hours to the Berkeley Marina, where he launched a small boat and went fishing alone. Receipts, parking records, and witness statements later confirmed that Scott had been in the marina area that day. This fact became central to the case, not because it disproved his story, but because of where Laci and her unborn son would later be found. While police continued to search for Laci, Scott Peterson's personal life drew increasing attention. Investigators learned about his relationship with another woman, Amber Frey. Amber later told police that Scott had informed her in early December that he had lost his wife and that this would be his first Christmas without her. At the time he made those statements, Laci Peterson was still alive. When Amber Frey came forward publicly, media coverage intensified. Scott Peterson became the focus of constant attention. His behavior was closely analyzed. Every interview, every public appearance, every word he spoke was scrutinized. Some observers described him as calm to the point of detachment. Others argued that reactions to stress vary and should not be interpreted as evidence. Law enforcement continued building a case based largely on circumstantial evidence. There were no eyewitnesses to a crime, no confession, no direct forensic evidence tying Scott Peterson to Laci's death. Instead, prosecutors focused on patterns. They examined Scott's movements on the day of Laci's disappearance. They reviewed phone records and computer searches. They reconstructed timelines. When Laci and Connor's remains were discovered in April 2003 along the shoreline of the San Francisco Bay, investigators noted their proximity to the Berkeley Marina. As this geographic connection became a cornerstone of the prosecution's theory, the condition of the remains indicated that they had been in the water for several months. Medical examiners could not determine an exact cause of death. The absence of clear trauma meant that many questions remained unanswered. Despite these uncertainties, prosecutors moved forward. Scott Peterson was charged with 2 counts of murder. The trial began in 2004 and quickly became a national event. Court proceedings were followed closely by the media. Every detail was debated. Prosecutors argued that Scott Peterson killed Laci and Connor and disposed of their bodies in the bay. They pointed to Scott's extramarital affair, his statements to Amber Frey, and his actions in the days following Laci's disappearance. They emphasized the location of the remains and Scott's fishing trip. The defense countered that the case relied entirely on circumstantial evidence. They argued that no physical evidence placed Laci in Scott's boat. They suggested alternative explanations, including the possibility that Laci had been abducted while walking the dog. Witnesses were called to testify about sightings of a pregnant woman walking a dog in the neighborhood on the morning of December 24th. These accounts were contested. Some witnesses were deemed unreliable. Others were questioned about timing and distance. The jury was tasked with evaluating a case built on inference rather than direct proof. After months of testimony, deliberations began. The jury found Scott Peterson guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder in the death of their unborn son. He was sentenced to death. Years later, the sentence would be overturned due to issues related to jury selection, though the conviction itself was upheld. Scott Peterson was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Throughout the legal process, debate surrounding the case never fully subsided. Supporters of the verdict argued that the evidence, taken as a whole, pointed clearly to guilt. Others continued to question whether the standard of proof had been met. The case became a lasting example of how circumstantial evidence can both convince and divide. Laci Peterson's disappearance began quietly on a holiday morning. It ended in a courtroom years later with a verdict that closed the case legally, but not emotionally. For many, the story remains unsettling, not because of unanswered questions, but because of how ordinary it seemed at the start. A walk with a dog, a quiet house, a day that was supposed to be routine. And then, nothing. As the legal process concluded, the Laci Peterson case entered a different phase. The courtroom proceedings were over. The verdict had been delivered. The appeals process continued, but the central outcome did not change. Scott Peterson would spend the rest of his life in prison. For Laci Peterson's family, the verdict marked an end to the legal chapter of the case, but not to the loss itself. Laci and her unborn son, Connor, were remembered as individuals rather than evidence. They were mourned as people whose lives were taken before they could continue. The case remained present in public memory long after the trial. It was revisited in documentaries, articles, and discussions about circumstantial evidence. Some viewed it as a clear example of how patterns and timelines can establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Others continued to debate whether the absence of direct physical evidence left room for doubt. The legal system, however, had reached its conclusion. What makes the Laci Peterson case endure is not only the crime itself, but the way it unfolded. It began quietly, without witnesses or obvious signs of violence. It moved slowly, built on inference and reconstruction. And it ended not with certainty for everyone, but with a verdict that forced the public to confront how justice is determined when answers are incomplete. Laci Peterson did not disappear in the middle of the night or in a remote location. She vanished on a familiar street, in her own neighborhood, on a morning that was meant to be ordinary. That ordinariness is part of what unsettles people. It suggests how quickly normal routines can fracture. In the years since, the case has often been referenced in discussions about media influence, public opinion, and the pressure surrounding high-profile trials. But beneath those discussions remains a simpler reality. A young woman who was preparing to become a mother did not get that chance. A child named Connor never had a life outside the courtroom narrative built around his death. And a family was left with a loss that no verdict could undo. Late at night, when stories like this are played quietly, they are rarely about reliving the details. They are about understanding how events move from everyday moments into permanent consequences. They are about recognizing how much of life depends on trust, routine, and the expectation that tomorrow will arrive as planned. The Laci Peterson case reached an ending that many cases never do. But even with a legal resolution, it continues to linger. Not because of spectacle, but because of the space between what can be proven and what can never be fully known. If you've listened through this case, you've followed it from a missing person report to a courtroom verdict. If a particular detail stayed with you, or if something in the timeline stood out, you're welcome to share it. Quiet reflection and discussion are often how cases like this remain understood rather than forgotten. If this calm, late-night approach to true crime is something you return to, more documented cases will follow. There is no urgency, no final note meant to provoke. Just another story, carefully examined, before the night continues. Thank you for listening. The Murders of the Clutter Family. Holcomb, Kansas. On the morning of November 15th, 1959, a small farming community in western Kansas woke to a silence that felt wrong. Holcomb was the kind of town where routines were invisible because they never changed. Cars parked in the same places, lights turned off at the same hours, Doors were often left unlocked. When a neighbor noticed that the Clutter family had not begun their day as usual, concern did not arrive all at once. It came slowly. The Clutter home stood just outside town, surrounded by open land and fields that stretched into the distance. Herb Clutter was known throughout the area, successful, disciplined, deeply involved in the community. By mid-morning, concern became action. When people entered the house, they discovered that the entire Clutter family had been killed during the night. Herbert Clutter, his wife Bonnie, and their two children, Nancy and Kenyon. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared stolen. The house was quiet. For Holcomb, the discovery marked the end of a belief that violence was something that happened elsewhere. Herb Clutter was 48 years old. He was a respected farmer, known for modern agricultural methods and strict personal habits. He did not drink. He did not gamble. He paid his workers well. His wife Bonnie struggled with periods of depression and spent much of her time at home. Their daughter Nancy was 16. She was active in school, well-liked, and involved in local activities. Their son Kenyon was 15. He enjoyed mechanics and working with his hands. On the evening of November 14th, 1959, the Clutter family followed their normal routine. There were no reported arguments, no visitors, no disturbances. They went to bed believing they were safe. Sometime during the night, that safety ended. When law enforcement arrived, they found a scene that did not make immediate sense. The victims had been restrained. They had been killed at close range, but the house itself was not ransacked. Drawers were mostly untouched. Valuables remained. Investigators searched for a motive and found none that fit. Herb Clutter was not known to have enemies. The family had no history of threats. The brutality of the crime stood in contrast to the lack of apparent reason. News traveled quickly. Reporters arrived from nearby towns, then from across the state. For residents of Holcomb, the presence of outside attention only deepened the unease. People locked their doors for the first time. Parents checked on children more often. Neighbors watched one another closely. Rumors spread, as they do when facts are scarce. Some believed the killer must have known the family. Others feared a stranger passing through. Kansas Bureau of Investigation agents joined local law enforcement. They worked through the night, documenting every detail. Footprints, tire marks, anything that might suggest how the killers arrived and left. There were no clear leads. The lack of evidence made the case feel unanchored. Then, hundreds of miles away, two men were already moving on. They had not known the Clutter family personally. They had not lived in Holcomb. Their connection to the house came from a rumor. One of them believed that Herb Clutter kept large sums of cash in a safe. That belief was wrong, but it was enough to bring them to the house that night. Their names were Perry Smith and Richard Hickok. At the time of the murders, they were traveling together, moving from place to place, surviving through small crimes and borrowed money. Hickok had heard about the Clutter family from a former cellmate who had once worked on the farm. The story was simple and unverified. A wealthy farmer, a safe full of cash, an isolated house. The idea stayed with Hickok. He spoke about it repeatedly. Eventually, it became a plan. On the night of November 14th, they drove to Holcomb. They parked away from the house and approached quietly. There was no forced entry. Herb Clutter allowed them inside. Followed would later be reconstructed through confession and testimony. The killers searched for the safe. There was no safe. There was very little money. At that point, the crime no longer served its original purpose. but it did not stop. By the time Perry Smith and Richard Hickok left the house, 4 people were dead. They took little with them: a small radio, a pair of binoculars, loose change. The emptiness of the theft stood in stark contrast to the permanence of what they had done. In Holcomb, investigators worked without knowing who they were looking for. There were no fingerprints on record that matched, no witnesses who had seen unfamiliar faces clearly. Leads were followed and discarded. Weeks passed. Fear remained. Meanwhile, Perry Smith and Richard Hickok continued traveling, unaware of how closely the investigation would soon narrow. What ultimately broke the case was not physical evidence. It was a conversation. A former inmate of Hickok's, hearing details of the crime, contacted authorities. The story matched too closely to ignore. Names were given. Descriptions followed. Investigators moved quickly. By the end of December 1959, Perry Smith and Richard Hickok were arrested in Las Vegas. They were brought back to Kansas. The questioning began slowly. Hickok spoke first. Smith followed. Over time, both confessed. Their accounts matched details known only to investigators. The case that had terrified a town was no longer unsolved. But understanding what happened did not make it easier to accept. For Holcomb, the arrests brought relief without comfort. The randomness of the crime lingered. The knowledge that the Clutter family had been killed for a rumor, for nothing, was harder to process than the idea of a personal motive. As the legal process moved forward, the case drew national attention. Not only because of the crime itself, but because of what it represented. The intrusion of violence into a place that believed itself immune. This was not a crime of passion, not a dispute, not a revenge. It was a collision between rumor, opportunity, and decision. And its consequences were irreversible. After the arrests, investigators began the long process of reconstructing what had happened inside the Clutter home. The confessions given by Richard Hickok and Perry Smith were detailed, but not identical. Each man described the same night from a different internal perspective. Hickok spoke methodically. He focused on logistics, how they arrived, how they entered the house, what they believed they would find. Smith spoke more emotionally. He described memories, impulses, and moments of hesitation. Together, their accounts allowed investigators to build a timeline that had previously been impossible. They had arrived late in the evening, after the Clutter family had settled in for the night. The house was quiet. Herb Clutter had not resisted when confronted. There was no struggle at the door. The absence of forced entry had confused investigators early on. Now, it made sense. The killers believed they were there for money. They moved through the house with a specific purpose. They restrained the family as they searched. The belief in a safe had driven everything, but there was no safe. What money they found amounted to very little. At that point, the original plan had failed. According to the confessions, the killings did not result from a sudden explosion of anger. They followed a decision, one that unfolded after the realization that the trip had been for nothing. The victims were not strangers in the abstract. They were people encountered face to face. Herbert Clutter had cooperated. Bonnie Clutter had been ill and largely confined to bed. Nancy Clutter and Kenyon Clutter had been asleep. There was no resistance that could explain what followed. That fact weighed heavily on investigators. The lack of necessity, the absence of escalation. The crime did not spiral out of control. It was concluded deliberately. When Perry Smith later spoke about the night, he described moments where he claimed to feel conflicted. He spoke about his childhood, about physical injuries and trauma, about anger that surfaced without warning. These statements would later become central to discussions about his mental state. Hickok, by contrast, described the crime in practical terms. He focused on what went wrong, the rumor that had misled them, the failure of the plan, the wasted effort. This difference in perspective would later matter in court. As the case moved toward trial, Kansas prosecutors prepared to present the evidence carefully. The physical evidence was limited. The crime scene itself had been preserved, but it did not point clearly to any suspect without the confessions. What gave the case strength was consistency. The details provided by the defendants matched what investigators already knew. Small facts that had never been public. Positions of objects, movements within the house, the sequence of events. These details were used to corroborate their statements. The trial began in 1960. For Holcomb, the courtroom proceedings reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. The Clutter family had been well known. Testimony about their final night was difficult to hear. The prosecution presented the crime as a robbery that turned into murder. The defense did not deny involvement. Instead, it focused on mental responsibility. Perry Smith's background was examined closely. His childhood had been unstable. He had suffered abuse and neglect. He had sustained injuries that some experts believed could have affected his neurological development. Psychiatric evaluations were introduced. The defense argued that Smith's capacity for judgment had been impaired. Hickok's defense followed a different path. He was portrayed as impulsive and opportunistic, but fully aware of his actions. The jury was asked to consider not just what happened, but how responsibility should be assigned. Throughout the trial, the question of motive remained unsettlingly thin. There was no financial gain worth mentioning. There was no personal vendetta. There was only a rumor, believed without verification. This randomness disturbed observers. It suggested that safety could be breached without warning for reasons that made no sense in hindsight. When the verdict was delivered, both men were found guilty of murder. They were sentenced to death. The decision was not greeted with celebration. It was accepted quietly. For the Clutter family's relatives, the verdict did not bring relief so much as finality. The legal process continued through appeals. Years passed. Smith and Hickok remained on death row. During that time, Perry Smith continued to speak with psychiatrists and writers. He reflected on the crime. He alternated between expressions of remorse and emotional detachment. Richard Hickok remained more consistent. He acknowledged responsibility but did not dwell on the moral implications. For the people of Holcomb, the case gradually shifted from immediate tragedy to collective memory. The house where the murders occurred stood as a reminder. The fields remained. The routines resumed. But the assumption of safety never fully returned. What made the Clutter case endure was not only the violence, but the way it disrupted belief. The belief that good people living quietly were protected by distance and familiarity. The belief that evil arrived with warning signs. This crime offered none. It came from a rumor, acted upon by strangers, and left nothing behind that made sense. By the time the executions were carried out in 1965, the case had already entered American consciousness. Not as a mystery, not as an unsolved crime, but as an example of how fragile normal life could be. As the years passed on death row, the Clutter case did not fade from attention in the way many resolved crimes do. It lingered. Not because of unanswered questions, but because of the way the crime resisted meaning. Perry Smith and Richard Hickok waited nearly 5 years between sentencing and execution. During that time, their lives became defined by repetition, cells, routine, appeals reviewed and denied. For Perry Smith, the waiting became a period of introspection. He spoke at length about his childhood, about physical pain, about feelings of anger and inadequacy that had followed him since adolescence. Psychiatrists continued to examine him. Some believed he suffered from neurological damage. Others believed he understood his actions clearly and acted with intent. Bonnie Clutter was remembered as a quiet presence, often misunderstood because of her illness. Nancy and Kenyon were remembered most vividly. Their youth made the loss feel sharper. In Holcomb, time moved forward, but not cleanly. New families arrived. Children grew up hearing the story secondhand. The house where the murders occurred eventually changed ownership. But for many residents, the memory of that November morning remained vivid. It was a dividing line. Life before, life after. In 1965, after all appeals were exhausted, Perry Smith and Richard Hickok were executed by hanging. The executions were carried out shortly after midnight. There were no speeches, no public ceremony. The state treated it as a conclusion of process, not a moment of spectacle. News of the executions reached Holcomb quietly. For some, it brought a sense of finality. For others, it brought very little at all. The Clutter family was not restored. The randomness of the crime was not explained. What remained was the record. In the years that followed, the case became widely known through a book that examined the crime in detail, blending reporting with narrative. That book brought national attention back to Holcomb and the Clutter family. It also shaped how many people understood the crime. For some, it humanized the perpetrators. For others, it risked overshadowing the victims. The debate about how true crime should be told began there, long before the term became common. At its center remained a question that had no satisfying answer. Why this family? Why this house? Why that night? There was no deeper motive uncovered, no hidden feud, no secret life. The crime did not resolve into meaning, and that, perhaps, is why it endured. The Clutter murders demonstrated that violence does not always grow out of passion, revenge, or desperation. Sometimes it grows out of assumption, out of rumor accepted as fact, out of a plan built on something that was never true. Herb Clutter did not keep a safe. There was no hidden money. That single false belief carried 2 men across Kansas and into a house where 4 people were living ordinary lives. The consequences of that belief were permanent. Late at night, when stories like this are told slowly, without urgency, the details take on a different weight. The absence of chaos becomes noticeable. There was no chase, no dramatic confrontation, no final struggle that changed the outcome. There was only intrusion, restraint, and decision. That is what unsettles people, not the violence itself, but how quietly it arrived. The Clutter family did nothing unusual. They followed routine. They trusted familiarity. That trust was not misplaced by any personal failing. It was simply exploited. In modern discussions of crime, the Clutter case is often referenced as an example of how narratives can distort reality. The killers were not masterminds. They were not driven by complex ideology. They were driven by a mistake, a rumor, a belief never questioned. The legal system responded as it was designed to respond at the time. Responsibility was assigned. Punishment was delivered. Understanding lagged behind. Even now, Decades later, the case resists closure in the emotional sense. It ends cleanly on paper. It does not end cleanly in memory. For Holcomb, the fields remain. The town continues. But the certainty that once defined daily life was altered permanently. People learned that violence did not need an invitation. It only needed opportunity. If you've listened through this case, you've followed it from ordinary routine to irreversible consequence, from rumor to decision, from silence to record. There is nothing left unresolved in the legal sense. But there is still something unsettled in how the crime sits in the mind. That is often the case with stories that refuse to explain themselves. They do not ask for reaction. They simply remain. As the years moved on, the Clutter case settled into a different kind of permanence. It was no longer an active investigation. It was no longer a trial unfolding in real time. It became part of the historical record. But history does not fade evenly. The memory of the murders never completely disappeared. It changed shape. For those who had lived there in 1959, the details remained sharp. They remembered the weather. They remembered where they were standing when the news reached them. They remembered the sudden presence of strangers in town, the questions, the unease. For those who came later, the case existed more quietly. It was something learned indirectly, a story told carefully, without embellishment. The Clutter family themselves became symbols of something larger. They were not remembered because of scandal or controversy. They were remembered because their lives had been ordinary. Herb Clutter's reputation endured as it had been in life. He was remembered as methodical, fair, and committed to progress. Bonnie Clutter was remembered more gently over time. As conversations about mental health evolved, her struggles were viewed with greater understanding. Nancy and Kenyon remained frozen at the ages they had been. Teenagers with unfinished lives, plans that never moved forward. The randomness of the crime continued to trouble people who studied it. There was no escalation that made sense, no pressure point that forced a decision. The violence did not erupt from chaos. It arrived through calculation, however flawed that calculation may have been. This detail is what separates the Clutter case from many others. There was no emotional storm, no personal conflict. There was a belief that something existed when it did not. That belief carried consequences that could not be reversed. Over time, the case influenced how crimes were discussed and documented. It marked a shift in how long-form crime narratives were approached. The focus moved away from spectacle and toward process, toward environment, toward decision-making, toward the ordinary circumstances that surround extraordinary harm. The Clutter murders also altered how people thought about safety. Not in a dramatic way. There was no call for panic. Instead, there was a quiet recalibration. People became aware that isolation did not guarantee protection, that familiarity did not equal security. This awareness did not vanish when the case was solved. It became part of collective memory. For Perry Smith and Richard Hickok, history closed more definitively. Their names became fixed to the crime. Their lives ended as the law required at the time. Debate about punishment continued long after their deaths. Some argued that the sentence had been necessary. Others questioned whether it had achieved anything beyond finality. Those debates never altered the facts. 4 people had been killed. 2 people had committed the crime. The state had responded. What remained unresolved was not legal, but human. How to understand a crime without motive. How to process violence that offers no explanation. As decades passed, the Clutter case continued to surface in discussions of crime, not because it was unsolved, but because it resisted interpretation. There was nothing to decode, no hidden pattern, no lesson that could be neatly summarized. It stood as a reminder that not all crimes emerge from complex forces. Some emerge from error, from assumption, from a belief never tested against reality. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, its weight comes from restraint. There is no sudden revelation at the end, no moment that reframes everything. The ending was already present at the beginning. Two men believed something that was not true. A family lived an ordinary evening. The collision of those realities produced consequences that outlived everyone involved. That is why the case continues to be remembered. Not because it asks to be solved again, but because it asks to be understood, and then accepts that understanding may never arrive. The Clutter family did not leave behind unanswered questions about their lives. They left behind a question about randomness, about how decisions made far away by people with no connection to a place can reshape it permanently. Holcomb returned to routine. Fields were planted, harvests came and went, children grew up. But the belief that routine itself was protection did not return. It had been replaced by awareness, quiet, permanent awareness. If you've listened through this case, you've moved through it the same way the town did. Slowly, without warning, without a clear lesson at the end. That is intentional. Some stories are not meant to conclude with certainty. They are meant to be held, not resolved. If a moment from this case stayed with you, or if the simplicity of its cause unsettled you, you're not alone. That reaction is part of why the story endures. About how decisions made far away by people with no connection to a place can reshape it permanently. Holcomb returned to routine. Fields were planted, harvests came and went, children grew up. But the belief that routine itself was protection did not return. It had been replaced by awareness. Quiet, permanent awareness. If you've listened through this case, you've moved through it the same way the town did. Slowly, without warning, without a clear lesson at the end. That is intentional. Some stories are not meant to conclude with certainty. They are meant to be held, not resolved. If a moment from this case stayed with you, or if the simplicity of its cause unsettled you, you're not alone. That reaction is part of why the story endures. If this calm, late-night approach to documented crime is something you return to, more cases will follow. They will not rush. They will not sensationalize. They will sit where they belong as the night continues. Thank you for listening.
The Night Stalker. The summer Los Angeles stopped sleeping. In the summer of 1985, Los Angeles stopped sleeping. Windows that once stayed open for night air were shut tight despite the heat. Porch lights remained on until sunrise. Gun sales increased. Neighbors began checking on one another before bed. The city did not know his name yet, They only knew the pattern. He came after midnight. He entered quietly, and he chose houses at random. The first confirmed killing connected to what would become known as the Night Stalker occurred in 1984, but it was in 1985 that fear truly spread. Victims ranged in age from young adults to the elderly. Some lived alone, some with spouses, some in modest homes, others in middle-class neighborhoods. There was no clear profile, no consistent income bracket, no predictable district, just entry through unlocked doors or windows, and then violence. He often approached on foot, dark clothing, sometimes a baseball cap, sometimes gloves. He carried firearms or knives depending on the night. He moved through houses like a shadow, silent until he wasn't. The randomness was what paralyzed Los Angeles. If criminals target specific neighborhoods, people adjust. If they target specific demographics, people rationalize. But when victims appear unrelated, when geography stretches across counties, fear multiplies. In March 1985, an elderly woman was murdered in her home. No forced entry. The attack was brutal. Weeks later, another elderly victim, then another. In some cases, jewelry was taken. In others, nothing of value disappeared. Sometimes there were signs of ritualistic behavior. Sometimes strange symbols were left behind. But at first, detectives did not immediately connect the crimes. Los Angeles in the mid-1980s was vast and fragmented. Jurisdictions overlapped. Sheriff's departments handled some areas. City police handled others. Patterns are harder to see when data is scattered. It was only as cases accumulated that similarities emerged. Victims were often attacked while asleep. Windows left open for ventilation during warm nights, windows cracked open. Air conditioning was less common. The killer exploited routine. He watched neighborhoods in advance, studied which homes went dark first, which houses lacked security bars, which bedrooms faced side yards. He preferred darkness over confrontation, surprise over struggle. In one attack, a couple was assaulted in their bedroom. In another, a single woman. In yet another, an elderly man shot while asleep. The method varied slightly. The intrusion did not. The media began using the name the Night Stalker. The label intensified panic because it suggested someone moving through the city deliberately, someone hunting. Law enforcement faced mounting pressure. The killer left behind limited physical evidence. In one instance, a shoe print was recovered, an uncommon brand, size 11, Avia sneaker. That detail would later become critical, but at the time, it was just a clue without a face. In some crime scenes, investigators noted symbols drawn, pentagrams or references to satanic imagery. This fueled media frenzy. Talk radio amplified fear. Rumors spread. Parents forbade teenagers from staying out late. Security companies advertised aggressively. Gun ranges filled with first-time buyers. Los Angeles in 1985 was already grappling with crime waves and gang activity, but this was different. This was intimate. Home invasion erodes the illusion of safety more deeply than street crime. It reaches into bedrooms, into moments of vulnerability. Late at night, when ceiling fans turn slowly and houses cool down, silence becomes noticeable. That summer, silence became suspicious. In July 1985, a fingerprint was lifted from a stolen vehicle connected to one of the crimes. The print belonged to Richard Ramirez. He was 25 years old, a drifter, born in Texas, raised in an unstable household, exposed early to violence and disturbing influences. He had moved to California in his early 20s, living transiently, hotels, friends' couches, cheap apartments. He had prior arrests for theft and drug possession, but nothing that prepared the public for what would unfold.
Before his identity was known publicly, Ramirez continued attacking. Victims described a thin man with dark hair, sunken eyes, a strong odor, poor dental hygiene that some later recalled vividly. He sometimes demanded money, sometimes jewelry, sometimes simply entered and attacked without prolonged interaction. In certain attacks, he forced victims to swear allegiance to Satan. These details, reported widely, intensified media sensationalism. But beyond the shock value, the core pattern remained. He chose unlocked entries. He struck between midnight and 4 a.m. He fled before neighbors could react, and he left entire households terrified. The police began coordinating more aggressively between jurisdictions. Task forces formed. Ballistics reports linked firearms used in multiple attacks. The Avia shoe print appeared at several scenes. Detectives canvassed shoe stores, tracked recent purchases. The brand was not widely distributed. It narrowed possibilities. But Los Angeles County holds millions of residents. The field was still vast. In late July 1985, 2 elderly women were attacked in Monterey Park. One survived. She provided a description that matched earlier witness accounts. The composite sketch circulated rapidly. It was broadcast on television, printed in newspapers, distributed to patrol officers. For the first time, the city saw a face. Thin, dark eyes, angular features. The effect was immediate. Tips flooded in, but many were false. Paranoia can distort identification. People began seeing the Night Stalker everywhere, in grocery stores, on buses, at gas stations. The real Richard Ramirez continued moving quietly, sleeping during the day, walking at night, sometimes taking public transportation, sometimes hitchhiking. He did not fit a polished criminal profile. He was erratic, addicted to cocaine, prone to impulsive decisions. But at night, he demonstrated focus, selection, entry, exit. In August 1985, a major break occurred. Ramirez left behind a fingerprint on the rearview mirror of a stolen Toyota. This time, it was clear. The print matched one already in the system from a previous arrest. His name became public. Richard Ramirez. The Night Stalker had a face and a record. Police released his mugshot. Television stations aired it repeatedly. Newspapers printed it on front pages. The city's fear shifted from unknown predator to known fugitive. But that did not reduce danger. It intensified the hunt. Once the name Richard Ramirez was released to the public in August 1985, Los Angeles shifted from fear to pursuit. His face was everywhere. Television broadcasts interrupted programming with updates. Newspapers printed his mugshot in bold ink. Radio hosts repeated the name hourly. The anonymity that had protected him vanished overnight. But before the identification became public, the violence had escalated. In the weeks leading up to the reveal, Ramirez attacked repeatedly. Couples shot in their beds, women assaulted in living rooms, elderly victims beaten without warning. He did not follow a strict victim type. Age ranged widely, neighborhoods varied, income levels differed. This randomness made profiling difficult. The Avia shoe print continued appearing at scenes. Detectives tracked distribution records and learned that only a limited number of that specific model had been sold in the Los Angeles area. It was not mass-produced. The rarity helped narrow investigative focus, but it did not immediately produce a suspect. Then came the fingerprint, lifted from the rearview mirror of a stolen vehicle abandoned after one of the attacks. The print was clear, strong, undeniable. It matched an existing record for Ramirez from a previous arrest. For the first time, they had more than pattern. They had identity. But Ramirez did not know immediately that his name had gone public. He continued moving as if still invisible, staying in cheap motels, visiting acquaintances, traveling by bus between neighborhoods. When he finally saw his face on television in late August 1985, the manhunt shifted into something volatile. Los Angeles was no longer just frightened, it was alert and angry. Residents began watching strangers more closely. The composite sketch had already created suspicion. Now the confirmed photo made recognition possible. On August 30th, 1985, Ramirez returned to Los Angeles after a brief trip to Arizona. He stepped off a bus at the Greyhound terminal downtown. He did not yet know that his image was on every news broadcast. As he walked through East Los Angeles, residents recognized him almost immediately. Someone shouted, another pointed. Within minutes, a crowd began forming. This was not organized law enforcement. This was spontaneous public reaction. People chased him through streets. He attempted to carjack a vehicle. The driver fought back. He was struck by bystanders, beaten, held down until police arrived. The man who had stalked sleeping homes was captured in day broadlight by the very city he had terrorized. The image of his arrest became symbolic, not just police capturing a fugitive, but a community responding collectively. When officers arrived, Ramirez was bloodied but alive. He smiled at cameras, raised a hand with a pentagram drawn on it during court appearances later. But at the moment of arrest, the panic in Los Angeles began to shift into relief. Still, relief does not erase trauma. The list of victims was long. More than a dozen murders, multiple sexual assaults, numerous attempted killings. Survivors carried permanent scars, physical and psychological. Ramirez's pattern exploited something simple: unlocked windows during warm nights, routine, trust in domestic space. He did not need elaborate planning. He needed opportunity. He walked neighborhoods looking for vulnerability. A window slightly open, a door without deadbolt. He entered quietly, often through a rear entrance, sometimes by climbing. He moved through homes with surprising calm, demanding money in some cases, assaulting without warning in others. There was no consistent script. That unpredictability amplified fear. Some attacks included forced declarations of satanic allegiance. Ramirez embraced the label publicly after media began reporting it. He leaned into the image. Courtroom theatrics would come later, but during the summer itself, the horror was less theatrical. It was domestic. A husband shot beside his wife, an elderly woman beaten in her sleep.
A child awakened by gunfire.
The Avia shoe became a symbol in its own right. Investigators distributed bulletins asking store owners about recent purchases. They cross-referenced receipts, interviewed clerks. The shoe print tied multiple scenes together conclusively. Without it, the crimes may have remained fragmented. Different jurisdictions might not have connected them as quickly. In the aftermath of his capture, law enforcement reviewed each scene meticulously. Ballistics evidence confirmed links between shootings. Fingerprint matches tied him to burglaries. Stolen items recovered. The picture sharpened. But for the residents of Los Angeles, the sharper image did not erase the months of fear. Parents remembered keeping lights on all night. Neighbors remembered forming informal watch groups. Some residents slept with weapons beside their beds. Security bars were installed across thousands of windows that year. Home alarm companies saw record demand. The Night Stalker had changed physical architecture in parts of the city. Metal bars became common in neighborhoods that previously left windows open. The psychological shift lasted longer than the crime spree. Late at night, the echo of that summer still feels present in the story. Because what Ramirez exploited was not wealth or poverty, it was routine. The assumption that midnight belongs to sleep, that windows can remain open for breeze, that quiet neighborhoods stay quiet. He moved between communities without prejudice, selecting houses based on accessibility rather than status, and that randomness created universal vulnerability. When the manhunt concluded with his capture, the city exhaled. But closure is never immediate. Each victim represented a separate rupture. Each surviving family carried memory into the future. And the city itself retained a lesson about darkness. To understand how the summer of 1985 unfolded the way it did, investigators eventually turned to the early life of Richard Ramirez. He was born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas. His childhood was marked by instability, violence, and exposure to disturbing influences at a young age. One of the most frequently cited influences was an older cousin, a Vietnam War veteran who reportedly shared graphic stories of violence and combat. There were accounts that this cousin showed Ramirez photographs depicting brutality from the war. In at least one documented incident, the cousin shot his wife in front of Ramirez during an argument. Exposure to violence during formative years does not predetermine criminal behavior, but repeated exposure without stability can distort boundaries between imagination and action. By adolescence, he had already begun engaging in petty theft and drug use. He dropped out of school, moved frequently, drifted. His criminal record prior to the Night Stalker murders included burglary and narcotics charges. He was not a model citizen, but he was not yet publicly known as a violent offender. When he relocated to California in the early 1980s, he lived transiently. Cheap motels, friends' couches, occasional day labor. He developed a cocaine addiction. Substance use fueled erratic behavior, but also extended wakefulness, useful for someone who preferred to move at night. Ramirez did not conform to a single psychological category. He did not exclusively target one age group. He did not confine himself to one neighborhood. This unpredictability made profiling difficult. Many serial offenders demonstrate narrow patterns, specific victim types or locations. Ramirez's pattern was broader. His common denominator was vulnerability: unlocked doors, accessible windows, sleeping occupants. He exploited opportunity rather than personal grievance. The satanic symbolism reported at several scenes drew intense media focus. Pentagrams carved on skin or drawn on walls. Verbal references to Satan. In court later, he would flash a pentagram on his palm. But psychological experts have debated how much of this represented belief versus performance. Some argue that he adopted the symbolism as an identity, something dramatic and fear-inducing. Others believe it reflected a genuine fascination. Regardless of motivation, it amplified terror, because it transformed burglary into something ritualistic in public perception. But beneath the symbols, the core remained intrusion and violence. In many cases, he shot victims first to neutralize resistance. In others, he used knives or blunt force. Sexual assault occurred in several attacks, but not all. There was no singular script. The inconsistency itself increased unpredictability. Late at night, when ceiling fans spin and houses settle into silence, the randomness of his selection feels most unsettling. He did not stalk one person over months. He stalked entire neighborhoods, walking streets after midnight, observing which homes were dark, testing doors, lifting screens quietly. He carried firearms when available. If not, he used knives. If not, he used objects within reach. Improvisation was part of his pattern. The Avia shoe print was one of the few consistent physical markers tying multiple scenes together. Investigators traced the shoe model to a limited retail distribution. When his arrest occurred, police found shoes matching the print in his possession. That link strengthened the chain of evidence. After his capture, detectives revisited earlier unsolved cases. Some earlier murders were reclassified as connected. The scope expanded. Ramirez's crime spree spanned roughly 14 months. The summer of 1985 was its most intense phase, but the fear it generated lasted far longer. Psychologically, Ramirez exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder: lack of remorse, manipulation, impulsivity. He reportedly smiled in court, made dramatic gestures, attempted to control the narrative. But courtroom performance is often superficial. The deeper pattern lies in behavior. He chose times when occupants were most vulnerable. He avoided confrontation during daylight. He fled quickly after assaults. He did not linger long at scenes beyond what was necessary to assert control. Despite media portrayals that leaned heavily into satanic imagery, the core behavior was opportunistic home invasion combined with extreme violence. That combination destabilizes communities because it turns the private sphere, the bedroom, into a site of fear. Los Angeles in 1985 became a case study in how serial crime reshapes urban behavior. Window bars increased. Neighborhood watch groups expanded.
Gun ownership rose. Even after his arrest, many residents kept lights on overnight for months. The Night Stalker became shorthand for vulnerability in darkness. For the victims' families, media attention offered little comfort. Names became headlines, faces circulated, but grief is not reduced by national awareness. Each home invasion was its own world shattered. Each survivor carried memories that extended far beyond the summer. In the broader narrative of American serial crime, Ramirez occupies a distinct place, not because he was the most methodical, not because he had the highest victim count, but because his attacks were spread across such a vast urban area in such a short time. The city felt under siege, and siege implies collective threat. After the arrest of Richard Ramirez in August 1985, Los Angeles did not immediately return to normal. Relief is not the same as restoration. The fear that had spread across neighborhoods did not evaporate overnight. Windows remained locked even during heat waves. Security bars stayed installed. Porch lights burned until dawn. The Night Stalker had changed behavior patterns permanently. For months, residents had gone to sleep wondering if their home would be the next one chosen at random. That randomness was the most destabilizing element. He did not confine himself to one block. He did not follow a predictable demographic pattern. He did not limit his victims by age. Children, elderly couples, young adults, anyone whose door or window offered opportunity. After his capture, police re-examined earlier unsolved burglaries and homicides across the region. Ballistics reports linked multiple shootings. Fingerprints confirmed connections. Stolen jewelry and personal items recovered from his possessions strengthened the chain of evidence. The shoe print, the size 11 Avia, remained one of the most significant physical anchors tying scenes together. Without that print, the crimes might have remained fragmented across jurisdictions. Instead, it became a symbol of the investigation's turning point. During trial proceedings, Ramirez embraced notoriety. He flashed satanic symbols in court, smiled at cameras, attempted to project defiance. But courtroom theatrics do not change the pattern of behavior that defined the spree. The true weight of the case rests not in headlines, but in households. Bedrooms, once considered private, became scenes of violence. Couples who had slept with windows open for decades began installing steel bars. Entire neighborhoods coordinated informal patrols. The summer of 1985 entered collective memory as the season when Los Angeles did not sleep. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the most unsettling realization is how little separated safety from danger. An unlocked window, a thin screen, a sliding door without reinforcement. That was often enough. He did not rely on complex planning. He relied on accessibility. And accessibility exists in every city. In many serial cases, victims share characteristics. In this case, what they shared was vulnerability in routine. Sleeping, trusting the quiet, believing the door was secure enough. The cultural impact extended beyond Los Angeles. National news amplified the fear. Other cities reviewed cold cases. Homeowners across the country reconsidered security habits. The term Night Stalker entered popular vocabulary as shorthand for unseen threat after midnight. Yet beneath the media narrative lies a simpler and heavier truth. Lives ended violently in spaces meant for rest. Survivors carried trauma forward. Families rebuilt without answers that could restore what was lost. The randomness remains the defining feature. If there had been a clear grievance, fear might have been localized, but randomness dissolves boundaries. It tells every household, you could be next. That is why the case still resonates decades later.
not because of satanic symbols, not because of courtroom spectacle, but because it targeted the universal human need for safety in sleep. When the city captured him, not just police, but residents who recognized and chased him, it symbolized something larger, a community pushing back against prolonged fear. Yet fear leaves residue. Even after sentencing, even after incarceration, even after years passed, security bars remained on many windows installed that summer. The architecture of Los Angeles changed subtly because of him, and architecture is memory in metal. The Night Stalker case stands as a reminder that vulnerability often lies in routine, in small decisions, in habits repeated nightly, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators rely not on complexity, but on opportunity. When lights go out and houses settle, the illusion of safety feels natural. But in the summer of 1985, Los Angeles learned that illusion can fracture quietly. One window, one step inside, one city holding its breath. Thank you for listening.
The last person seen with Hae Min Lee. On a cold afternoon in January 1999, a high school student finished her classes, got into her car, and then disappeared. She had plans that day, places to be, people expecting her, but she never showed up. And by the time anyone realized something was wrong, the last person known to have seen her alive would become the center of a case that still divides people decades later. Imagine this for a moment. You're 18 years old. School just ended. You're supposed to pick up a family member, maybe meet a friend, just a normal day. And then, somewhere between leaving school and reaching your destination, you vanish. No call, no message, no trace. Hae Min Lee was a senior at Woodlawn High School in Baltimore County, Maryland. She was described as outgoing, responsible, and driven. She played sports. She had a close group of friends. And, like many teenagers, she was balancing school, relationships, and plans for the future. She had recently ended a relationship with her ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed. From the outside, it seemed like a normal teenage breakup. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, at least not at first. On January 13, 1999, Hae attended school like any other day. Classes, friends, routine. But by the end of that afternoon, something changed. Hae was supposed to pick up her younger cousin after school. It was something she did regularly, but that day she never arrived. At first, it didn't seem like an emergency. People assumed she might be delayed. Maybe she stopped somewhere. Maybe plans changed. But as hours passed, concern turned to worry. By that evening, her family knew something wasn't right. Hae was responsible. She didn't just disappear without telling anyone. Now think about this carefully. If someone who always follows a routine suddenly breaks it without explanation, what would your first instinct be? Would you assume something simple or something serious? Police were eventually notified and a missing person case began. But early on, there were very few clues. No signs of struggle, no abandoned belongings, no immediate evidence pointing in any direction. Her car was missing, she was missing, and the timeline between leaving school and disappearing was unclear. But there was one detail that investigators kept coming back to. Who saw her last? Because in cases like this, the last known interaction often becomes the most important. And that's where the focus began to shift.
Witnesses recalled that Hay had been seen at school that day, talking to friends, going about her normal routine. But after school, her movements became harder to trace. Some students remembered seeing her leave, others weren't sure. Timelines started to blur, and memory, as investigators would learn, isn't always reliable. But one name kept coming up: Adnan Syed, her ex-boyfriend. He had been at school that day, he knew her schedule, and according to some accounts, he had asked her for a ride after school. That detail would become extremely important, because if he did get into her car, he may have been the last person to see her alive. Now think about this carefully. If someone asks for a ride and that person disappears shortly after, would that immediately raise suspicion for you? Or would it still feel like a coincidence? At the time, though, nothing was certain. Investigators were still trying to piece together basic information: where she went, who she spoke to, what happened in those critical hours. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still there were no answers. Then, nearly a month later, a discovery was made in a wooded area in Baltimore. A body, partially buried, hidden just enough to delay discovery, but not enough to remain hidden forever. And when authorities confirmed the identity, the case changed instantly, because this was no longer a disappearance, it was a murder. But the biggest question still remained unanswered. What happened between the moment she left school and the moment her life ended? And more importantly, who was with her during that time? We'll come back to that ride request because it becomes one of the most debated details in this entire case. And as investigators continued digging, they would uncover a timeline filled with contradictions, uncertainties, and one witness whose story would change everything. In the weeks after the disappearance of Hae Min Lee, investigators began focusing on one thing above all else: the timeline.
Because somewhere between the final school bell and the time she was supposed to pick up her cousin, something had happened. And that window was small. At first, police revisited the school. They spoke to students, teachers, friends, trying to reconstruct those last known moments. Who saw her leave? Who spoke to her last? Who might have been with her? But as with many cases involving dozens of teenagers, memories were inconsistent. Some students thought they saw her, others weren't sure. Some details changed over time. And then there was that one detail: the ride request. Multiple people recalled that earlier in the day, Adnan Syed had asked Hae for a ride after school. He didn't have his car, or at least that was the explanation given. At first, this didn't seem unusual. They had dated, they knew each other well. A ride wouldn't be strange. But now, in the context of her disappearance, that simple request began to carry weight. Because if she agreed, then he may have been with her during that critical window. Now think about this carefully. If someone is the last known person to request time alone with a victim, how much should that matter in an investigation? Is that enough to suspect them, or just one piece of a much larger puzzle? When police initially spoke to Adnan, he denied asking for a ride, or at least his responses were unclear. He said he didn't remember. That day was like any other. Nothing stood out. And that answer would later become important. Because forgetting details is normal, but forgetting whether you asked someone for a ride on the day they disappeared raises questions. As investigators continued digging, another element began to emerge: phone records. Adnan had a cell phone, and in 1999, cell phones were far less common than they are today, which made those records valuable. Outgoing calls, incoming calls, tower pings. They began mapping his movements through those signals, and what they saw didn't fully match his statements. Now, cell tower data isn't always precise. It gives general locations, not exact positions, but it can still paint a picture. And the picture that began to form suggested movement across different parts of the city that day. At the same time, investigators were trying to understand Hayes' final movements. Where did she go after school? Did she leave alone? Did she meet someone? There was no confirmed sighting of her after school, no witness who could definitively say, "I saw her at this time, in this place." That gap in the timeline became the center of everything. Then came a major development. A witness came forward, someone who claimed to know what happened. His name was Jay Wilds. Jay told investigators that Adnan had shown him Hayes' body, that he had confessed to killing her, and that Jay himself had helped bury the body. This was the first time investigators had a direct narrative, a story connecting the victim to a suspect with details. But that story came with complications because Jay's account changed. He gave multiple versions, details shifted, timelines adjusted. Some parts remained consistent, others didn't, and that created a dilemma. Now think about this carefully. If a key witness changes parts of their story, does that make the entire story unreliable? Or does it still hold value if some core details stay the same? Investigators believed that despite inconsistencies, Jay knew details that only someone involved would know. One of the most important details was the location of Hayes' car. At that point, her car had not been found. It was a missing piece. Jay led police to the car, and that changed everything, because knowing the location of the car was something only someone with inside knowledge could have. But even that raised questions. How did Jay know? Was he telling the truth, or was there something else happening behind the scenes? As police built their case, they began connecting the dots. Ride request, phone records, witness testimony, behavior after the disappearance, and slowly the focus narrowed. Adnan Syed was arrested and charged with murder.
But even after the arrest, many questions remained unanswered. Because this case was not built on a single piece of evidence. There was no direct forensic proof, no DNA, no eyewitness to the crime itself. It was a case built on timelines, statements, interpretations. And that's where the uncertainty began to grow. Because when a case depends on interpretation, different people can see it differently. We'll come back to Jay's testimony because it becomes one of the most debated aspects of this entire case. And as the trial approaches, the question shifts from what happened to what can be proven, and whether the story being told is the truth or just one version of it. As the case moved closer to trial, the story that prosecutors would present began to take a clearer shape. It was built around a simple idea that on the afternoon of January 13, 1999, Adnan Syed had been alone with Hae Min Lee in her car. That something happened during that time, and that everything that followed was an attempt to cover it up. But the strength of that story depended heavily on one person, Jay Wilds. Jay's testimony became the backbone of the case. He told the jury that Adnan had strangled Hae, that he shown him her body in the trunk of her car, and that later that evening they buried her together in a wooded area. It was a detailed story, but it was also a story that had changed multiple times.
Dates shifted, locations shifted. The sequence of events wasn't always consistent. And that raised a critical question. If a story changes, how much of it can you trust? Now think about this. If someone tells the same story but with different details each time, does that make them unreliable? Or does it mean they're trying to remember something complicated? Prosecutors argued that despite inconsistencies, Jay knew too much. Too many details that only someone involved could know. The defense saw it differently. They argued that Jay had been pressured, that his story evolved because it was shaped during police interviews, that without him, there was no case. And that was partly true, because outside of Jay's testimony, the evidence was largely circumstantial. There was no direct forensic link tying Adnan to the crime, no DNA evidence placing him at the burial site, no eyewitness to the act itself. Instead, the prosecution relied on patterns, behavior, timing, and interpretation. One of the key elements they emphasized was Adnan's behavior after Hay disappeared. They pointed out that he did not call her, not once. Now, at first glance, that might not seem unusual. They had broken up. People move on. But prosecutors argued something different. They said that someone who had just lost contact with a close friend, someone they had recently dated, would likely try to reach out, at least once. Now think about this. If someone you cared about suddenly disappeared, would you try to call them, or would you assume everything was fine? That question became part of how jurors interpreted his actions. Then there were the phone records, calls made that day, locations suggested by cell tower data, connections between different points in the timeline. The prosecution used these to support Jay's version of events, to place Adnan in certain areas at certain times. But the defense challenged this. They argued that the cell tower data was unreliable, that incoming calls in particular could not accurately determine location, and that created another layer of uncertainty. Because now the case wasn't just about what happened, it was about how much trust to place in the evidence itself. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the case began to attract attention. People started asking questions, looking at the details, comparing timelines. Years later, the case would gain even more attention through media coverage and investigations. But even during the trial, there were already doubts. Because this wasn't a case with a single clear piece of evidence. It was a case built from pieces. And depending on how you arranged those pieces, you could see different pictures. We'll come back to one specific moment in Jay's testimony, a moment that prosecutors said proved everything. But before that, there's something else to consider. Because in cases like this, it's not just about what is said, it's about what cannot be proven. And as the trial moved toward its conclusion, the jury would have to decide between two possibilities: that the story presented to them was true, or that there were too many unanswered questions to be certain. And that decision would determine the rest of Adnan Syed's life.
As the trial of Adnan Syed moved toward an end, the case no longer revolved around just one question. It had become two: what happened to Hae Min Lee, and whether the story presented in court was enough to prove it. The prosecution stood by a clear narrative that Adnan had been with Hae after school, that something happened inside her car, and that everything that followed, the calls, the movements, the burial, was part of a plan to hide what he had done. They pointed to the ride request, to Jay Wilde's testimony, to the phone records, to behavior that, in their view, didn't match someone innocent. The defense challenged each part. They questioned Jay's changing statements. They argued the timeline didn't fully hold together. They raised doubts about the reliability of the cell tower data, and they emphasized the absence of direct physical evidence. No DNA, no eyewitness to the crime, no definitive proof placing Adnan at the exact moment Hay's life ended. Now think about this. If a case is built mostly on interpretation, how certain can a conclusion ever be? Is a consistent story enough? Or does there always need to be something more concrete? After hearing everything, the jury reached a decision. Adnan Syed was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. For years, that seemed like the final chapter, a case closed, a verdict reached, a life defined by that decision. But the story didn't end there, because over time, questions continued to surface. Journalists revisited the case. Podcasts examined the details. New audiences looked at the same evidence and began asking the same questions all over again. Was the timeline accurate? Was Jay's testimony reliable? Did the phone records truly place Adnan where prosecutors said he was? And perhaps the biggest question of all, did the court get it right? In 2022, more than 2 decades after Hay disappeared, the case took a dramatic turn. Adnan Syed's conviction was vacated. He was released from prison. Prosecutors cited issues with the original investigation, concerns about evidence, and the possibility that alternative suspects had not been fully explored. But even then, the story didn't reach a clear ending, because later legal developments reinstated aspects of the case, and debates about guilt, innocence, and justice continued. To this day, the case remains one of the most discussed in modern true crime, and that's because it sits in a space that is uncomfortable, not fully resolved, not completely unanswered, but somewhere in between. Now think about this carefully. If you were on that jury, hearing only what was presented in that courtroom, what would you have decided? And knowing everything that came afterward, would your decision change? Because in the end, this case leaves behind something more than just a verdict. It leaves behind a question. Not just about what happened to Hae Min Lee, but about how we decide what the truth really is. Thank you for listening.